The city of Oskuldsvær flickers, its massive power grid gasping like a dying beast. Below the industrial sprawl, Eirik Vinter-Haugen jams a jagged copper conduit into the main geothermal vent. Superheated vapor screams against the iron floor, turning the air into a shimmering haze of lethal pressure. His right hand grips the intake lever, skin turning gray and brittle as it calcifies into raw, igneous rock. The hum of the city returns to life, but the cost is written in the stone spreading up his forearm. Eirik drops to his knees, his heavy stone hand thudding against the metal grate like a dropped boulder. He peels back his sleeve, watching the gray, jagged texture of obsidian crawl toward his elbow. The thermal siphoning process demanded a price, and his own flesh was the currency. He breathed in the metallic tang of ozone and sulfur, his lungs burning with the exertion of the illegal tap. Above him, the flickering streetlights of the slums steadied into a harsh, unwavering white glare. He knew the heat guild would notice the sudden surge in power consumption. A small, flickering console on the wall beeped, displaying a massive spike in his unique energy signature. Eirik grabbed a heavy wrench and smashed the monitor, showering the floor in sparks and shattered glass. He stood up, his right arm feeling dead and heavy, a limb made of volcanic crust. He walked to the window, peering out at the towering, opulent spires of the upper district. Astrid Fjellgunner sat in her high-altitude observatory, her eyes fixed on a glowing map of the city's energy flow. She traced the anomalous spike in the slums with a manicured, gloved finger. Her lips curled into a thin, sharp line of calculated irritation. She signaled to her guards, ordering a sweep of the lower sectors to identify the source of the unauthorized draw. Eirik retreated into the shadows of his workshop, his calcified fingers scraping harshly against the stone walls. He needed to hide the evidence of his transformation before the inspectors arrived. He pulled a length of scavenged industrial piping from a pile of debris, sliding it over his rigid gray arm. The metal groaned as he forced it into place, masking the unnatural texture of his skin. He heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots marching through the mud outside his door. He grabbed a heavy cloak, wrapping it tightly around his shoulders to conceal his hunched frame. The city's emergency was a lie, a manufactured crisis designed to test the limits of the grid. He realized now that the guild was bleeding the slums dry to maintain their own artificial longevity. The door to his workshop groaned under the pressure of a heavy kick, the wood splintering inward. Eirik stood perfectly still, his heart hammering against his ribs as the inspectors swarmed into the room. They carried thermal scanners that pulsed with a dull, rhythmic red light. One of the guards pointed his scanner directly at Eirik's chest, the device chirping an erratic warning tone. Eirik held his breath, his stone arm aching with a dull, throbbing heat that radiated from the volcano's core. He forced his expression into a mask of weary, working-class indifference. The guard stepped closer, his eyes scanning the room for signs of illegal geothermal modifications. He nudged a pile of copper wiring with his boot, his face twisting in disgust at the squalor. Eirik prayed the thick industrial pipes would shield his signature from their sensors. The guard paused, his gaze lingering on the heavy cloak covering Eirik's right side. Eirik took a slow, steady step backward, his boots crunching on the debris of the shattered monitor. He needed to lead them away from the vent, away from the evidence of his crime. The guard reached out, his gloved hand hovering inches from Eirik's hidden stone-hard shoulder. Eirik moved with sudden, calculated force, shoving a heavy crate of scrap metal into the inspector's path. The resulting crash echoed through the narrow, suffocating corridor of the slums. The inspectors turned, their attention diverted by the sudden chaos of the falling metal. Eirik slipped into the darkness of the ventilation shafts, his stone arm scraping against the narrow, rusted walls. He was a ghost in the machine, a man slowly becoming the very thing he sought to control. The volcano rumbled beneath his feet, a deep, tectonic growl that vibrated through his brittle, hardened bones. He knew the eruption was no longer a theoretical threat. It was a scheduled event. He reached the end of the shaft, looking down at the massive, glowing core of the city's power system. It was a beautiful, terrifying sight, a swirling vortex of molten energy held in check by fragile, failing valves. He had hijacked the system, but he was now a prisoner to the power he had stolen. He pressed his stone palm against the cold glass of the observation deck, watching the magma churn below. The heat was intoxicating, a siren song calling to the stone that now replaced his nerves. He had to find a way to stabilize the pressure without drawing more energy from the core. His own body was the only conduit he had left, a bridge between the city and the fire. He closed his eyes, sensing the flow of electricity like 1,000 tiny needles piercing his skin. He was Eirik Vinter-Haugen, and he was the only thing standing between Oskuldsvær and total annihilation. The inspectors shouted in the distance, their voices muffled by the thick, insulated walls of the complex. He turned his back on them, focusing his mind on the intricate, glowing schematics of the grid. He began to reroute the power, his mind mapping the complex, hidden circuits of the city. Every adjustment cost him, a fragment of his humanity flaking away like ash in the wind. He would save the slums, even if he had to become the foundation of the city himself. The stone reached his shoulder now, a cold, unyielding weight that made every movement a trial of endurance. He ignored the pain, his focus narrowing to the singular, desperate goal of the night. The city would sleep tonight, unaware of the man turning to stone in the dark. And the guild would continue their feast, oblivious to the cracks forming in their ironclad world. Eirik watched the flickering lights of the city, a small, grim smile touching his lips. He was the error in their perfect system, the glitch that would eventually bring it all down. The magma surged, a bright golden light illuminating the chamber and casting long, jagged shadows against the walls. He stood at the precipice of his own destruction, ready to pay the price for one more day of survival. The debt was high, but the rebellion had only just begun. The heavy iron door of the workshop shudders under a rhythmic, metallic pounding. Astrid Fjell-Gunnar stands on the threshold, her long white coat stark against the grime of the slums. Steam rises from the floorboards where her boots melt the thin layer of frost. Eirik pulls a heavy, rusted pipe over his right arm, concealing the jagged gray stone. The metal bites into his skin, cold and unforgiving. Astrid steps inside, her eyes scanning the room with the precision of a thermal sensor. She moves past a stack of salvaged copper, her gloved fingers trailing over the workshop's makeshift workbench. Her presence feels like a drop in temperature, sharp and biting. Eirik stands rigid, keeping his left hand visible and steady. Astrid stops before a flickering monitor, the blue light reflecting in her sharp, narrow eyes. She points a gloved finger at the fluctuating energy readings on the screen. The guild requires an explanation for the surge that rattled the district, she states. Eirik gestures toward the humming geothermal vent, his voice low and raspy. He claims the pressure in the magma vein reached a critical threshold, threatening a total blackout. Astrid watches him, her expression unreadable behind a veil of aristocratic coldness. She knows the slums lack the tech to tap the core, she whispers. Eirik pretends to adjust a valve, keeping his calcified arm tucked deep within his cloak. He explains the theory of a harmonic dampener, a way to bleed off excess heat safely. Astrid tilts her head, her gaze lingering on the unnatural stillness of his right shoulder. She demands a live demonstration of this supposed engineering breakthrough. If the grid fails during the test, she promises, he will be executed on the spot. Eirik nods, his heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm against his brittle ribs. He walks toward the main distribution manifold, his movements stiff and measured. The stone in his arm grinds with every step, a dull ache radiating through his shoulder. Astrid follows, her heels clicking against the frozen metal floor. She taps a command into her personal console, opening the primary intake valves. A roar of molten heat floods the chamber, turning the air instantly searing. Eirik grips the iron lever with his left hand, his skin flushing red from the sudden spike. The heat demands a response, a conduit to channel the raw energy away from the building. He knows he must draw the power into his own body to prevent a catastrophic explosion. He reaches out with his hidden stone-covered hand and touches the glowing conduit. The surge hits him like a physical blow, vibrating through his bones. His arm turns a deeper, darker shade of gray as the radiation calcifies his flesh. He holds the connection, his teeth gritted against the overwhelming, searing pressure. Astrid watches the monitor, her eyes widening as the energy stabilizes within the system. She sees the readings dip into the safe zone, the volcano's fury momentarily held in check. Eirik pulls his hand away, the air around him shimmering with residual heat. He collapses against the workbench, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Astrid approaches him, her shadow falling long and dark across his face. She stares at the pipe covering his arm, her eyes suspicious and hungry. The demonstration was successful, she admits, her voice devoid of warmth. She reaches out, her hand hovering just inches from his hidden stone-hard arm. Eirik flinches, his muscles locking in a desperate, silent defense. Astrid laughs, a sharp, brittle sound that cuts through the humming of the machinery. She turns toward the door, her coat billowing behind her like a shroud. She leaves him with a warning that the guild will be watching his every move. Eirik watches her silhouette disappear into the swirling, snow-filled darkness of the alley. He peels back the pipe to reveal his arm, now entirely encased in smooth obsidian rock. The stone glows faintly, a reminder of the power he now carried inside his own veins. He touches the cold, hard surface of his skin, feeling nothing but the hum of the volcano. The slums were safe for another day, but his humanity was fading fast. He looks at his reflection in the cracked monitor, a stranger staring back with eyes of ash. The guild would return, and he would have to be ready to burn them down. He begins to dismantle the valve, his fingers moving with the precision of a machine. The secrets of the magma vein were now his to guard, a burden of fire and stone. He turns off the lights, leaving the room in shadows and silence. Outside, the wind howls against the iron walls, a constant, mournful reminder of the frost. He knows the eruption is coming, a scheduled end to the city's long, cold winter. He sits in the dark, waiting for the next signal from the shifting earth. Every pulse of the volcano feels like a heartbeat, heavy and slow inside his chest. He is the bridge between the fire and the ice, a man caught in the middle of a war. The guild thinks they control the grid, but they are merely playing with a dying flame. He closes his eyes, feeling the tectonic plates grind deep beneath the city's foundation. The pressure is rising, a slow, inevitable march toward the final, fiery collapse. He is Eirik Vinter-Haugen, and he is the only thing standing between the city and the end. His arm feels heavy, an anchor pulling him down into the depths of his own design. He stands up, his movements heavy and deliberate, like a statue coming to life. He walks to the window, watching the flickering lights of the upper-tier spire. Astrid is there, planning her next move, unaware of the cracks spreading beneath her feet. He knows the truth now, the secret that the guild hides behind their iron masks. The city is a tomb, and he is the one who will carve the final, desperate epitaph. He turns back to the workbench, picking up a rusted wrench with his stone-hard hand. The metal bends under his grip, a testament to the strength he has stolen from the core. He begins to work, his mind a whirlwind of schematics and desperate cold calculations. The night is long, and the fire in his veins is the only light he has left. The heavy iron door of the distribution chamber groans shut. Eirik stands before the primary intake manifold. His fingers tremble against the cold, rusted surface of the valve. Astrid stands in the observation gallery above the floor. She taps a glass screen with a gloved finger. A series of red warning lights flicker to life along the walls. The pressure gauges needle into the crimson danger zone. Eirik watches the primary cooling vent refuse to open. The machinery emits a low, agonizing screech of strained metal. He knows the guild intends to trigger a total system collapse. Heat ripples through the floor plates, warping the steel beneath his boots. He reaches for the manual bypass lever with his left hand. The stone-encased limb feels heavy, cold, and unnaturally dense. He slams the lever downward, but the mechanism remains jammed. Astrid smiles from her high vantage point behind the reinforced glass. She signals the guards to seal the secondary exits. Eirik feels the air turn thick with the scent of ozone and sulfur. The central pipe glows a violent, pulsing shade of orange. He realizes the reactor core is approaching critical mass. He moves to the conduit junction behind the main turbine. His breath hitches as the heat singes his eyebrows. He places his stone-hard palm against the vibrating copper casing. The thermal siphoning begins with a sharp, piercing hum. Heat pours into his body, bypassing his natural resistance. His skin cracks along his forearm, revealing layers of black obsidian. The pain is a white-hot spike driving through his nervous system. He grits his teeth, his jaw muscles locking in a rhythmic spasm. The room shakes as the excess energy bleeds into his frame. His heart beats once, a slow, heavy thud that rings in his ears. Another heartbeat follows, sluggish and deep like a shifting tectonic plate. He holds the connection, his feet sliding backward on the floor. The glow in his arm intensifies, casting harsh shadows against the walls. Astrid's expression shifts from mockery to genuine, sharp-eyed surprise. She watches the pressure gauges drop back into the green zone. Eirik drops to his knees, his arms smoking in the frigid air. The stone has spread past his elbow, reaching toward his shoulder. He gasps for air, but his lungs feel tight and constricted. His heart rate remains low, a steady, mechanical drum in his chest. The chamber falls into an eerie, suffocating silence. Astrid descends the stairs, her boots clacking against the metal grate. She stops inches from his slumped, trembling form. She stares at the obsidian skin creeping up his neck. She demands to know how he survived the surge. Eirik remains silent, his eyes fixed on the cooling reactor. He feels the cold of the city pressing against his skin. He knows the guild will never let him walk away freely. Astrid reaches down, her fingers grazing his stiff stone shoulder. She pulls her hand back as if burned by the sudden chill. She whispers that his body is becoming a repository for the core. She turns and walks toward the exit without another word. Eirik struggles to stand, his legs feeling like pillars of lead. He looks at his hand, now a jagged, dark sculpture of rock. The slums are quiet, saved from the explosion by his sacrifice. He feels the heavy, rhythmic thrumming deep within his ribcage. He is no longer just an engineer in a dying city. He is a living conduit for the volcano's ancient, lethal fire. He drags his feet toward the dark tunnel leading back home. The shadows of Oskuldsvær stretch out to meet him. He knows the guild will come for his secrets by dawn. He hides his arm beneath his heavy, grease-stained work coat. The cold air bites at his face, but he feels nothing. His internal heat has reached a new, dangerous equilibrium. He walks through the alley, his shadow long and distorted. The machines in the distance hum a low, warning tune. He is the bridge between the fire and the frost. He reaches his workshop and collapses onto the stone floor. The darkness of the room swallows his labored, rhythmic breathing. He waits for the next surge of the volcano's pulse. His life is now measured in watts and tectonic tremors. He is the clockwork heart of a city that fears him. He closes his eyes and listens to the earth grinding below. The pressure is building, and he is the only one who can feel it. He is ready for the guild's next move. He is ready to burn the foundations of their power down. Eirik crawls through the narrow ventilation shaft of the guild's subterranean processing plant. He pulls his heavy, grease-stained coat tighter to hide the jagged obsidian of his left arm. Below him, the floor of the chamber glows with a sickening, artificial violet light. He peers through the metal grate, his eyes scanning the rows of pressurized glass canisters. 10 children sit inside the pods, their small chests rising and falling in rhythmic, forced unison. A series of copper wires snakes from the base of each pod into the central junction box. Eirik watches a blue terminal display the text, Thermal Affinity Harvesting, Cycle 402. His stomach turns as he recognizes the guild's official seal embossed on the glass. He realizes the guild is not merely managing the power grid to prevent a catastrophe. They are draining the very life force of the city's youth to sustain their own longevity. He grips the edge of the grate until his stone fingers leave deep indentations in the steel. He records the serial numbers of the pods onto a scrap of parchment with a piece of charcoal. He needs to build a decentralized grid to bypass these central harvesting nodes. He marks a hidden junction point on his map, his breath hitching in the cold metallic air. A heavy boot clicks against the floor plates in the corridor outside. Eirik freezes, his heart beating a slow, mechanical thud against his ribs. He replaces the grate silently, his movements stiff and practiced despite the encroaching stone. He retreats through the shadows of the ventilation system, his obsidian arm clanking against the wall. He navigates the labyrinthine tunnels toward the sector known as the Drip. The air here tastes of salt, rust, and the lingering ozone of a failing district. He reaches a heavy iron door and knocks 3 times in a specific, uneven pattern. The door creaks open just enough for a single, wary eye to peer out. Kale, a local scavenger with soot-stained cheeks, gestures for him to enter the cramped room. Eirik steps inside, his coat brushing against piles of salvaged scrap metal and frayed cables. He lays the parchment on a table cluttered with blueprints and half-finished circuit boards. He explains that the guild is harvesting children, not just managing the geothermal flow. Kale stares at the map, his face pale in the flickering light of a dying oil lamp. He agrees to help Eirik source the conductive copper needed for the independent grid. Eirik trusts him, unaware of the small communicator hidden in Kale's sleeve. They spend the next 3 hours mapping out the connections to the lower city's conduits. Eirik's stone arm begins to throb with a dull, rhythmic ache as he touches the cold copper. He ignores the pain, his focus entirely on the design of the decentralized bypass. He believes they can isolate the slums from the guild's main power drain by dawn. A sudden, sharp, metallic bang echoes from the hallway outside the room. Kale stands abruptly, knocking his chair backward against the wall. The door bursts open, splintering inward under the force of a heavy, armored shoulder. 3 of Astrid's enforcers stand in the threshold, their long rifles glowing with lethal heat. Eirik reaches for his tools, but his stone-hard arm feels sluggish and heavy. Kale backs away toward the corner, his gaze fixed on the floor rather than his friend. The lead enforcer steps forward, his boots crushing the schematics on the floor. He points a gloved finger at Eirik, his voice cold and devoid of any human warmth. He declares that the High Overseer Astrid has been tracking this specific energy signature. Eirik realizes the betrayal as Kale avoids his eyes, clutching a pouch of silver coins. The enforcers raise their rifles, the barrels whining as they charge with thermal energy. Eirik slams his obsidian hand into the power conduit running along the room's wall. He initiates a localized surge, drawing heat from the cables to overload the enforcers' weapons. The room erupts in a blinding flash of white light and screeching, warped metal. Eirik dives through the window, shards of glass slicing into his shoulder and back. He hits the wet pavement of the alleyway, his body sliding through the freezing slush. He scrambles to his feet, his stone arm smoking as it absorbs the shock of the blast. He runs into the darkness, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. He hears the enforcers shouting behind him, their heavy armor clattering on the cobbles. He knows the guild will hunt him through every street and tunnel in Oskuldsvær. He grips his obsidian arm, the stone spreading further toward his shoulder with every step. He is wounded, betrayed, and hunted, but the secret of the harvest is now his burden. He disappears into the fog of the lower city, his shadow long and distorted against the frost. The guild's grip on the city is absolute, but he has the blueprint to break it. He finds a narrow crevice between two buildings and squeezes into the dark, silent space. He listens to the distant, rhythmic thrumming of the city's massive, artificial heart. He knows the rebellion is small, but it is the only spark left in the freezing dark. He waits for the enforcers to pass, his stone skin blending into the shadow of the wall. He is the only one who can stop the harvest, even if it costs him his remaining humanity. The cold bites at his face, but he feels only the heat of the volcano inside his chest. He prepares to sacrifice everything for a city that does not yet know it is dying. Eirik crouches in the damp crevice, his breath hitching in his chest. Frost crystals cling to his eyelashes, blurring the flickering lanterns of the passing enforcers. His obsidian arm glows with a faint, dying orange heat. He looks down at his chest, where a jagged crack splits the skin near his sternum. He hears the faint, grinding sound of his ribs shifting beneath the heavy wool of his coat. Each inhalation feels like swallowing ground glass. The heat he absorbed from the enforcers' rifles is trapped, swirling uselessly inside his hardening marrow. He presses his palm against the icy stone wall to bleed off the excess thermal energy. A thin wisp of steam rises from the contact point, hissing into the stagnant tunnel air. He realizes his body is no longer a conductor, but a containment vessel on the verge of failure. He reaches into his satchel and pulls out the salvaged data slate. The screen displays a rhythmic, pulsing map of the magma vein volcano. He traces the lines of the geothermal flow with a shaking, stone-tipped finger. The pressure readings are not erratic, as the guild claimed in their public reports. They are perfectly synchronized, pulsing like a mechanical heart on a strict, timed interval. He stares at the data, his eyes widening as the pattern repeats. The volcano is not shifting naturally under the tectonic weight of Oskuldsvær. Astrid is pumping coolant into the outer chambers to mask the deliberate pressure buildup. She is building the eruption, not suppressing it. He drops the slate, the clatter echoing too loudly against the frozen tunnel walls. He forces himself to stand, his legs feeling heavy and disjointed, like two pillars of unworked granite. He walks deeper into the dark, his footsteps heavy and uneven on the slick cobbles. The temperature in the tunnel drops, frosting the pipes running along the ceiling. His internal heat is failing, and the cold of the city is beginning to claim his extremities. He reaches a ventilation shaft and pulls himself up with his one good arm. The metal grate groans, bending under the unnatural strength of his calcifying grip. He pulls his body into the narrow crawlspace, leaving a trail of gray, stone-like dust behind. He pauses to rest, his head lolling against the cold, sweat-slicked steel. He thinks of the children mentioned in the guild ledgers, their lives used as fuel for the city's longevity. He knows now that their sacrifice was never about maintaining the current grid. It was about powering the machinery required to trigger the final, catastrophic eruption. He looks at his obsidian hand, now stiff and immobile, the fingers locked in a permanent claw. The calcification is spreading toward his heart, turning his pulse into a slow, rhythmic thud of stone against stone. He hears the distant hum of the city's power grid vibrating through the floor plates. It is a steady, artificial drone that masks the groans of the dying earth below. He crawls forward, his body scraping against the jagged edges of the ventilation duct. He finds a small observation port overlooking the central turbine hall. Below him, hundreds of guild technicians move in precise, synchronized patterns. They are adjusting massive, glowing pressure valves that lead directly down into the volcano's throat. He watches as a technician turns a dial, releasing a burst of pressurized magma gas into the cooling system. The turbine spins faster, the sound rising to a high-pitched metallic scream. He realizes they are not cooling the core, but feeding it a volatile, explosive cocktail. He grips the edge of the observation port until the metal buckles. His breath comes in short, jagged bursts, his lungs struggling to expand against his hardening ribs. He sees Astrid Fjellgunner standing on the central gantry, her silhouette sharp against the blinding light of the turbine. She is watching the pressure gauges with the calm, detached focus of a master clockmaker. He understands the scale of her ambition. She intends to wipe the slate clean, using the eruption to consolidate the last of the city's resources. He pulls back from the port, his mind racing through the schematics of the cooling system. He has the knowledge to reverse the flow, but his body is becoming a statue. He feels the cold creeping into his abdomen, numbing the pain of his broken ribs. He knows he cannot survive the journey to the main control hub. He looks at his arm, the obsidian surface now glowing with a dull internal light. He is a walking bomb of concentrated geothermal energy. He realizes his purpose has shifted from engineer to a final desperate failsafe. He crawls toward the main conduit, his movements slow and agonizingly stiff. Every inch of progress costs him a layer of his remaining humanity. He reaches the primary junction box, the air thick with the smell of ozone and burnt insulation. He presses his stone-hard hand against the main power line, his eyes fixed on the flickering blue light. He begins to drain the heat from the turbine hall, pulling the energy into his own fracturing body. The turbine below slows, the screeching sound fading into a low, mournful groan. Astrid looks up, her eyes scanning the rafters for the source of the sudden power drop. He stays hidden in the shadows, his body shuddering under the immense, searing weight of the diverted heat. His skin cracks further, the stone spreading across his neck and jaw. He watches the pressure gauges on the wall drop as the volcano's pulse begins to stabilize. He is buying the city time, but he is paying for it with every beat of his heart. He hears the enforcers approaching the ventilation shaft, their heavy boots clanging against the steel. He knows they will find him soon, but the turbine is already silent. He slumps against the conduit, his strength failing as his body turns entirely to igneous rock. The light in his eyes dims, replaced by the dull, flat color of volcanic glass. He can no longer move, but he can still hear the panicked shouting of the technicians below. Astrid is screaming orders, her voice thin and desperate as the power grid flickers and dies. He stares at the ceiling, his consciousness tethered to the cooling metal of the conduits. He is becoming part of the machine, a silent observer in the heart of the guild's spire. He feels the cold of Oskuldsvær pressing in, but the volcano is finally quiet. He waits in the dark, his stone heart beating once, twice, and then falling into a heavy, eternal silence. Eirik drags his heavy, stone-weighted body toward the central spire. His boots scrape against the iron floor grating. Each step leaves a faint, gray smear of crushed rock behind him. The guild's spire looms ahead like a jagged silver needle. Steam hisses from the external cooling vents, obscuring the path. He checks his obsidian hand, the fingers locked in a permanent, clawed grip. The skin of his forearm is now entirely translucent, showing a dull, pulsing internal glow. He reaches the heavy brass door of the containment chamber. He presses his palm against the locking mechanism. The lock glows orange, then melts under the concentrated heat of his touch. The door swings open with a low, mournful groan of tortured metal. Astrid Fjellgunner stands at the center of the room. She stares at a bank of glowing pressure gauges. Her coat is crisp, white, and perfectly clean against the industrial grime of the chamber. She does not turn around when he enters. She tells him that he is late for his own execution. Eirik walks forward, his legs stiffening with every meter he gains. He points his obsidian hand toward the master control console. The console hums with enough energy to power the entire district. Astrid smiles without looking at him. She warns him that the containment field is the only thing tethering the mountain. She reveals that her experiments were never meant to trigger an eruption. She claims the volcano is already dying, and she is feeding it to keep Oskuldsvær alive. Eirik looks at the flickering monitors. The data streams show the magma levels rising toward the city floor. He realizes her stability is a slow, calculated suffocation of the core. He lunges toward the central energy conduit. His stone-hard arm strikes the casing with a ringing metallic clang. Astrid draws a small silver pistol from her waist. She fires, but the bullet flattens against his igneous skin, dropping harmlessly to the floor. Eirik ignores her and grips the vibrating copper pipe. He begins to siphon the heat from the guild's grid. The room dims as the lights flicker and die. Astrid screams as her control panels go dark. She begs him to stop, shouting that the pressure will spike without her regulation. Eirik feels his legs turning to solid, unmoving rock. The calcification spreads upward, passing his hips and creeping toward his spine. He looks at the pressure gauge on the wall. The needle is climbing into the red zone. He sees the truth in her eyes, a desperate, frantic fear for the city. She is not a tyrant, but a prisoner of the same dying mountain. He must decide whether to release the heat or let the stone consume him. The choice is a weight heavier than his own hardening body. He grips the conduit tighter, his fingers fusing with the metal. His heart beats once, a slow, heavy thud of stone against stone. He chooses the city over his own pulse. He pulls the full, raw heat of the volcano into his chest. The air in the room ignites, turning the oxygen into a blinding blue haze. Astrid shields her eyes, falling back against the reinforced glass. Eirik's jaw freezes in a silent roar of agony. His vision blurs as his consciousness begins to drift into the machines. He is the bridge between the fire and the frost. The spire trembles as the energy flows through his fracturing skeleton. He is no longer a man, but a silent, igneous monument. The volcano's roar fades into a steady, rhythmic hum. Astrid stands in the silence, watching the man who saved her world. Eirik remains motionless, his eyes turned to flat volcanic glass. He is the final failsafe, locked in place forever. The central spire hums with a frequency that rattles Eirik's teeth. His fingers fuse into the copper casing of the master geothermal core. Molten heat flows from the pipe and into his hardening wrist. His skin turns from gray stone to a translucent, glowing obsidian. The calcification spreads upward, locking his elbow into a rigid, bent angle. Astrid watches from the observation deck, her face bathed in flickering blue light. She taps a command into her console, diverting the excess surge into the city grid. Eirik's vision narrows to a pinprick of white light. His legs stiffen, anchoring his boots to the iron floor grating. A web of glowing cracks patterns his neck, pulsing with the volcano's raw rhythm. He attempts to pull his hand away, but the metal and his flesh are one. The temperature in the chamber drops as he drains the heat into his own body. Astrid smiles as the pressure gauges on the wall fall back into the safe zone. She adjusts her collar, her movements precise and devoid of any lingering fear. Eirik's knees lock, and the last of his human posture vanishes. His ribcage stops its rhythmic rise and fall. He stares at the master console, his eyes fixed in a glassy, immobile gaze. The silence in the room is absolute, save for the low thrum of the core. Astrid walks toward him, her footsteps echoing against the cold metal floor. She stops inches from his stone face, peering into his sightless eyes. She mocks his sacrifice, calling him a glorified fuse for the city's greed. Eirik hears her words, but his mind is no longer trapped in his head. His consciousness drifts into the copper conduits and the sprawling city grid. He feels the power surging through the veins of Oskuldsvar like liquid fire. Astrid turns back to the monitor, her fingers dancing across the interface. She pulls up a schematic of the city's defensive perimeter. She toggles a switch, and the power grid shifts from domestic to military output. Eirik watches through the camera sensors mounted in the spire's ceiling. He sees her weaponize the energy he just stabilized. The lights in the slums dim, sacrificed to power the guild's new cannons. He tries to shout, but his mouth is a jagged, unmoving sculpture of rock. The calcification is complete, trapping him in the core of his own failure. Astrid leaves the chamber, the heavy brass door locking behind her with a final clang. Eirik remains in the darkness, a silent monument to the city's survival. His stone heart beats once, a slow, heavy thud against the cooling copper pipe. He is the bridge, the battery, and the prisoner of the guild's new empire. The volcano settles into a dormant, rhythmic hum beneath his feet. He focuses his mind on the flickering wire that leads to the lower districts. A small spark jumps between two terminals in the ventilation shaft. He begins to push his will into the cold, dead iron of the spire. The city sleeps, oblivious to the man turned to stone in its center. Eirik waits in the dark, his gaze fixed on the endless stream of data. He learns to navigate the grid, one electron at a time. He maps the guild's security protocols, searching for a single, hidden weakness. His existence is a cycle of cold metal and the distant heat of the core. He is the ghost in the machine, watching the city prepare for war. Astrid returns to the spire every morning to calibrate the weaponized output. She never looks at the statue, treating him like a piece of industrial furniture. Eirik tracks the power flow, noting every drop of energy stolen from the poor. He gathers his strength, waiting for the moment the grid fluctuates. The city's survival is guaranteed, but his work has only just begun. He is a statue of igneous rock, but his mind is a spark in the dark. He prepares to rewrite the rules of the guild from the inside out. The city of Oskuldsvar hums with a stolen, infinite vibration. Eirik stands at the heart of the master core, a statue of obsidian and grief. His eyes are fixed, sightless glass spheres, reflecting the constant flicker of the guild's control room. Astrid walks past the dais, her heels clicking against the cold, iron floor. She pauses to check the pressure gauges, her fingers tracing the edge of the copper casing. She does not notice the faint, rhythmic pulse of light beneath the statue's stone skin. Eirik watches the flow of data across the room's massive, glowing monitors. He feels the electricity like a second nervous system, branching out into the freezing city. He isolates a single wire, threading his consciousness into the copper veins of the lower districts. In the slums, a rusted heating unit in a cramped apartment flickers to life. A young laborer stares as the dead pipes begin to hiss with unexpected, clean warmth. Eirik pushes a command through the grid, bypassing the guild's restrictive flow valves. The power surges, hidden beneath the standard output, invisible to Astrid's sweeping sensors. He maps the city's defensive grid, identifying the exact nodes where the guild hides their weaponized thermal cannons. Every electron he moves is a deliberate strike against the order Astrid built. He is the ghost in the wiring, the silent architect of an uprising he can no longer lead. Astrid sits at her desk, her brow furrowed as she reviews the day's energy consumption logs. She taps a command, trying to throttle the flow to the outer industrial sectors. Eirik resists, locking the valves from the inside, his stone will anchoring the energy where it belongs. The screens in the control room stutter, displaying a brief, jagged pattern of static. Astrid frowns, leaning closer to the interface, her reflection ghostly in the darkened glass. She does not see the statue's fingers twitch, a microscopic shift in his calcified grip. Eirik sends a pulse through the lines, a coded sequence of heat that mimics a heartbeat. It travels through the walls, reaching the hidden cells of the resistance huddled in the vents. They see the lights blink in a sequence they recognize from the old blueprints. The message is clear, a silent command to begin the final coordinated strike. Astrid stands up, her hand hovering over the master override switch. She senses a dissonance, a flaw in the perfect cold efficiency of her empire. She walks back toward the core, her eyes narrowing as she inspects Eirik's unmoving, obsidian face. She stops, her breath hitching in the frigid air of the spire. On her private monitor, a single glowing symbol of resistance flares into bright, defiant life. You look at the screen and see the flickers of light, believing they are just glitches in the system. You do not realize the cold iron in your own walls is already listening. The cycle of the fire never ended. It only waited for you to turn your back.